The world of Alan Moore's Saga of the Swamp Thing is one of death and decay. A harsh place where hope is rare, and the darkest of terrors are waiting in its creeping shadows. But even in the darkest places, love can grow. And in 1985, the strangest, most beautiful of loves began to blossom. A love that transcended physical boundaries and typical definitions. The relationship between Abigail Arcane and Swamp Thing is the beating heart of Moore's saga. It's the reason for Swamp Thing regaining his sense of self during the existential horror of the anatomy lesson. The reason why he travels to hell and risks his soul in love and death. The consummation of their love is issue 34, Rite of Spring. A moment of psychedelic lovemaking that says volumes about their connection, and addresses our roles within the natural world through images and ideas that pierce flesh and soul. Abby and Swamp Thing are lovers living in a dying world, their romance surrounded quite literally by death. Issues 32 through 36 of the Saga of the Swamp Thing, published from January through May of 1985, shift wildly in tone, topic, and theme. The result is that Rite of Spring is caught between two issues on either side that deal with death, pollution, and cycles of desperation. When viewed in this context, Rite of Spring shines even more brightly as a beacon of love that transcends physical bonds to create something beautiful. That love is both reflective of our own relationships and transgressive in its ideas of a woman and a monster becoming intimate, deepening Moore's story and informing the rest of this saga. Before this iconic issue, Moore and his fellow artists pushed the flexible boundaries of their comic to what is possibly their limit with issue 32, Pog. At once a tribute to cartoonist Walt Kelly and his long-running comic strip Pogo, as well as a tragedy of animal cruelty. Pog is illustrated by Sean McManus, and his exaggerated characterizations are better suited for this Kelly tribute than the rougher, more darker-edged take of regular artists Stephen Bissette and John Tuttleben. McManus filling in was also a bit of a necessity, as the typical artistic duo was beginning to fall behind schedule, leading to this issue and the use of a fill-in for number 33 to prevent delays. Pog has a group of cartoonish alien travelers land on Earth, specifically in Swamp Thing's bayou, in search of a new home. After the hellish terrors of the previous story, Pog feels like whiplash, and is likely confusing to anyone unfamiliar with the subject of homage happening here. So, some context. American cartoonist Walt Kelly published the daily newspaper strip Pogo from 1948 until his death in 1973. In it, Pogo Possum, Albert Alligator, and their many different animal friends from Okefenokee Swamp were used by Kelly to satirize and comment on then-current social, political, and environmental issues. Moore makes it clear that underneath the colorful spacesuits of his alien characters are the familiar forms of Pogo and his swamp friends, now in the midst of a tragic interstellar journey. Through the use of their pictorial stories, comic strip characters now in a comic book using visual storytelling to communicate with Swamp Thing, layers of storytelling nested within more layers of storytelling. We learn that these sad, anthropomorphic characters fled from their home planet after a group of creatures began slaughtering and eating all the other animals, abusing the natural harmony of their once peaceful lady, as the characters say in their portmanteau-filled language. It's a strange language built from Kelly's own comic strip, and Pog perhaps gives us our most succinct encapsulation of Swamp Thing himself from the viewpoint of Pogo. I knew you wouldn't be antaggravated. You're made out of the same ingredients as the lady. You must be her gardener, or some such. Moore's take on Pogo ups the environmental commentary of these swamp dwellers and turns their story into a tragedy. These are creatures in search of peace and harmony, but their arrival on Earth is suddenly cut short when the sympathetic Swamp Thing shows that humans here eat meat, and the lovable, cartoonish alligator we've quickly come to sympathize with is killed by his much more realistic cuzlings. The sight of these wholesome but downtrodden animals subjected to the horrors of Earth turns stomachs and darkens thoughts. How can I tell my kindlings that I let myself be seduced by a disillusion? How can I tell the histricide that he was right? That there is no lady? That it was all just trifles? Trifles light as air? Perhaps these lonely aliens will find a peaceful planet to start again before extinction. Perhaps Swamp Thing will help turn the Earth into a better, more harmonious place. But it doesn't seem likely. By attributing and highlighting Kelly's commentary, Moore telegraphs to the reader that Swamp Thing will continue on in the late cartoonist's spirit, complete with his ecological commentary. More on that later. Similar to the crossbreeding of classic comic strip and modern horror comic, issue 33, Abandoned Houses, connects modern DC with its older, non-canonical past. Here, Moore and editor Karen Berger decided to reprint an older story to deal with continued art delays. Specifically, the first conflicting appearance of Swamp Thing in House of Secrets number 92 from July 1971. Much of this origin story reflects the common Swamp Thing origin. Scientist caught in an explosion is turned into a muck-encrusted mockery of a man. But creators Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson had set the story around the turn of the 20th century and named the character Alex Olson, with his wife not killed in the blast and instead saved by the Swamp Thing from her murderous new husband. Wein and Wrightson soon revised the concept for a modern setting with the debut of Swamp Thing Volume 1 in 1972, removing this short gothic horror story from continuity in favor of a longer-lasting concept. In Abandoned Houses, Moore and fill-in artist Ron Randall create a wraparound story that has Abigail enter the Dreaming and encounter Cain and Abel, the biblical brothers who became the hosts of DC's anthology series House of Secrets and House of Mystery, which were cancelled a few years prior. These titular abandoned houses remain, and when Abby enters the House of Secrets, Abel shows her the story of the Alex Olson Swamp Thing, suddenly pulling this original story back into continuity, and revealing Alec Holland as only the latest in a long line of protectors of the green. Like the revelations found in the anatomy lesson, Moore has once again enacted a massive paradigm shift within his comic, only with a lot less explanation and fanfare. This recontextualization has pushed Swamp Thing into the archetype of the Green Man, a spiritual protector of nature found in many religions and myths, and here seen as Earth's elemental champion. The seasons are embodied within him, and, as we will soon see, his consciousness is one with the world. Suddenly, the saga of the Swamp Thing is only a small piece of a millennia-spanning story. Something far larger than the love between Swamp Thing and Abigail, far larger than the current battles being waged by our ecological hero, and it means that something far more dangerous is looming on the horizon. As Abigail awakens, she forgets the revelations given to her while asleep, but we as readers cannot. Nevertheless, the peace of mind she is afforded, for now, lets love take root. And at the start of Rite of Spring in issue 34, we see Abby contemplating the drastic changes that her life has gone through over the last several story arcs, with her coming to realize that she loves Swamp Thing, a man that is very different than any human she has ever known. But through it all, her feelings remain, voiced with difficulty but reciprocated by the hero. "You're a plant, for God's sake. Just saying it out loud, I mean, it's just so funny. How could you love me?" Deeply, silently, and for too many years. Abby questions how the two could express their love physically when they have no traditional means of doing so. But Swamp Thing, overgrown with flowers from the spring, offers her a tuber grown from his body. When she eats it, her perceptions begin to change. Communing with the one she loves has allowed her to share in Swamp Thing's consciousness. We as readers see this change in our own perceptions, and are sucked into this suddenly omniscient, overwhelmingly aware worldview. To illustrate this massive change in perception, the returning Bissett and Toddleben flip the book on its side. Both Abby and Swamp Thing, once so seemingly vastly different, are seen as being the same types of luminous beings, far removed from this crude matter we see with human eyes. And what was once seen as disturbing, the many insects alive within Swamp Thing's plant body, become beautiful jewels of light. Perceptions shatter. Time slows. The smallest of details form into complex galaxies. And Abby and Swamp Thing's thoughts meld, becoming the poetry within our heads as the two slowly become one. Where we touch, the fibers merge and intermingle. I am no longer certain where I end, where he begins. I feel my own hand as he feels it, a warm bird caged within my strong green fingers, pulse hammering in its breast. We blur together, unresisting. The bubbles rise. Bissett and Toddleben create a collage of spiraling, intermingling images, where life and death coexist as portraits of the world, and every beautiful, vibrant, fleeting moment in nature crystallizes within the minds of readers and characters. Abby is at once microscopic within the larger world, and big enough to engulf it. We catch a brief glimpse of the two melding together into a more feminine Swamp Thing. The bark encrusts my flanks. The moss climbs my spine to embrace my shoulders. We are one creature, and all that there is in us. The natural world within and the natural world without has always been there, but for the first time, Abby has been allowed to see it in all its mind-shattering glory. For her to be truly intimate and joined with Swamp Thing in love, who is himself at one with the greater world, Abby must become part of this greater world. And for Swamp Thing, who was once forced to realize that his humanity was never real, this psychedelic lovemaking with Abby is the closest human connection he has ever had in his strange life. It throbs, it breathes, in the world, in its fibers. The pulse quickens, strands tighten, draw taut, a clenched glove in my stomach. Abigail and Swamp Thing's psychedelic communion climaxes with a complete melding of these two souls. With me, with him. The visions fade and Abby returns to our normal perception, head still spinning from the journey, basking in the afterglow of lovemaking. Their second kiss now solidifies their relationship, and we can see that both spring and their love is in full bloom. It's something universal and beautiful that still captures the essence of everyday love and connection in our own relationships. That relationship would continue to grow with more saga. The way I see the Swamp Thing and Abby is that they're very much in love, said Moore. There's no reason why they should have a terrible time and break up just to give everyone some sort of vicarious soap opera thrill. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's sort of refreshing to write about a relationship that works. The harmony found between Swamp Thing and Abigail, as well as between the couple and the world around them, is quickly disrupted by the Nukeface Papers in issues 35 and 36. Prior to these two issues, Moore's Swamp Thing stories were focused on the horrors of natural rot, decay within the body that occurs whether we like it or not, and the supernatural terrors that transcend flesh. The two-part Nukeface Papers illustrate the horrors of radioactive contamination and nuclear waste. Man-made terrors polluting the natural world and destroying anything they contact. The ecological commentary of Swamp Thing is a natural evolution for Moore's series. If you thought that a left-leaning comic about a living plant dedicated to the defense of the world wouldn't eventually turn toward critique of industrial pollution and corruption, especially in the hands of an author whose most well-known work at this point in his career was a violent takedown of Thatcherism in Britain, I've got some news for you. The Nukeface Papers basically lacks all subtext. Unlike the cartoonish subversion of Pog, these two issues are a sledgehammer, with Moore turning the antagonist of the story into a literal walking source of radiation poisoning addicted to drinking nuclear waste. These two issues explore his effects on the lives of normal people as well as the corrupt workers who bury toxic sludge in the swamp. If that wasn't enough to make the commentary clear, Bissett embeds real-life newspaper clippings into the panels of the story, further highlighting the connections between Nukeface and the everyday news at the time. All those newspaper clippings I pasted into the penciled pages weren't pulled from an archive of similarly themed stories, revealed Bissett. I took them solely from my daily newspaper during the 8 or 9 weeks I spent penciling those two issues, and I didn't have to look hard to find them. Even if the metaphor of a nuclear wino accidentally poisoning everyone he comes across isn't the strongest way to make a point, the presence of these real-world articles continues reminding the reader of the dire situation waiting outside the story. Whether its blunt, somewhat tactless message works depends on the reader. The character of Nukeface himself was originally created by Toddleben and Bissett years earlier during a pitch, with the pair also proposing a story inspired by the town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, which has been plagued with a constantly burning coal mine fire under its streets since 1962. At the time Toddleben and Bissett pitched the story, the underground fire had already been burning for decades, rendering Centralia a ghost town, and it's still burning in 2019. That polluted, burning town is glimpsed but not named in the Nukeface Papers. But the connection to the fiery wreckage of Centralia draws a direct link from 1962 to 1985 to today. The Nukeface Papers ends with Swamp Thing's body dissolved by nuclear poisoning, and Nukeface wandering off in search of more toxic waste in America. The news headlines finally fill the closing splash page to the brim, as a sense of real-world anxiety and nuclear doom form an antithesis to the hopeful, celebratory closing splash of the anatomy lesson. Moore, Bissett, and Toddleben end this portion of Swamp Thing's ongoing story with unanswered questions regarding the fate of both their ecological hero and the real world itself. One of those questions would soon be answered in issue 37, Growth Patterns, which would begin Swamp Thing's 14-issue-long American Gothic storyline. It's a story of strange, supernatural struggles that reflect the darkness within America. One where easy answers would be hard to come by, and the simple idea of good triumphing over evil would be dispelled. Springtime quickly fades in the horrific world of Swamp Thing, but love can transcend it and make it a little more beautiful. Hold on to it while you can.